I'm going to uh, kind of suggest something almost to be the devil's advocate, as it were. I've been giving a lot of ideas about things for the future that um, could be kind of developed further. And I want to just give a kind of cautionary note around the idea of absolutism. So sometimes we can have this idea of, oh my gosh, this person just comes up with really, really good ideas. Or they have this characteristic that, it looks like a trend that looks very hopeful. Like it's a very positive trend, and you're almost like you want to attribute some kind of success to this person and almost place bets around it. So it's a kind of gambling, and you'll see this, I think, with like I don't really know how this works, but sometimes you'll have like horse tracks or people who will train horses or dogs, and they'll kind of place bets around them. It's a type of gambling that I don't think is very healthy, but it could be a pastime. That could be something that's maybe someone dabbles in for a little bit just to kind of understand and then quits. But anyway, um, sometimes people believe that their kids are gifted in a certain way or that they come from a certain lineage and they have practices that they think are valid ones, and they're not really sure, like it's not pseudoscience, it's not superstition, because they're so immersed in it, they don't know anything else other than that this is what we understand our religion to be. So how are you to know like what's good religion and what's not good religion? And that's a good question, because when I went to Carleton, we studied religion as a phenomenon of kind of like understanding how people like to group each other. And I think the difference between what I understand religion to be and any kind of cult, maybe, is that religion tends to be something that's based on understanding the divine, whereas cults sometimes deal with supernatural that might be malevolent. And we don't really know, like, I don't know what the practices are, but if it's raising the dead or if it's trying to call on something that's like, let's pretend, for example, I had a husband who died and I'm trying to preserve him in some way, and I just keep him on life support and I just assume that I can maintain his life in some way, even though he's like a vegetable. Like, I don't know how different practices around the world examine that or kind of try to understand what that could mean. Like, is there a certain amount of life before you can, safely take someone off of life support? Some people will say it's like you're killing them. We don't know when somebody will be returned back to life after being on life support for so long. I don't know how to answer that question, just because to me, I feel like if they're sleeping and they do wake up, what's their quality of life going to be? Like, it's hard to say. Kind of the question I had asked before is that if someone decides to go with chemotherapy, for example, if they've got cancer, they might go through the radiation or take whatever medicine they have to take. But you have to understand these medications are very, very toxic, right? And the quality of life may improve, but it may not. And so that's something you kind of have to decide for yourself. Like, what are you willing to invest in? So I bring this up because like I said, I have a history in my life that kind of intertwines with jinn and intertwines with malevolent studies around uh, like how do we preserve something that we love because we believe in a next life. And that's fine, but if you understand it from the sense that you believe in the next life, but you don't have control over time, right? So how are you supposed to know that you are going to wake up at, you know, 500 years from now versus maybe within thousands of years? You're not really going to know. So some people say, well, we'll just keep people in a morgue, like we'll just kind of like Captain America. And so I don't know, I don't really know how to understand the idea around that, because if I go back to scientific bias, the problem with being somebody who is invested in something is that you try to make it come true regardless of what signs kind of show you otherwise. So let's pretend that I am someone who works in pharmacology, right? So I like to create medication and I try to see what is something that is a health problem that a population is struggling with. And let's assume it's obesity. So people who are very, very, very overweight, that it's actually hurting their body. They can't move, it's hurting their back, it's hurting their bones, like their joints, and it's putting way too much pressure on their heart. So I'm trying to find a medication that makes it easy for them to lose weight, or maybe suppresses their appetite a little bit. So, or maybe increases their energy so they're able to exercise and then they're not eating as much. And then maybe finding a way to help almost use up all the extra fat in their body. So it's almost like the body is fueling itself. There could be so many different ways that I could think of problem solving this. Now, because this is a medication I am trying to promote and trying to create, if I am shown a lot of, first I have to go to the ethics board, like I mentioned, like I have to make sure that a lot of people have studied what my method is, what the purpose is, and then they decide, okay, this looks like it's safe. Like everything you're doing right now looks safe. And they're studying the chemicals maybe that I'm creating this drug with, and they're saying, yeah, it shouldn't harm somebody. It might have some side effects, but we'll see what those are. So then you tell these people, like you're asking for volunteers, and then after a while they all decide, you decide maybe you have 5 people who are volunteering. You're like, that's good enough for now. And as you're volunteering, people get really, really sick. They start vomiting. They start maybe some like parts of their body start to like have like really weird growths on them. But you try to ignore these, and you're just like, no, 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 no. This is part of what it's supposed to be because your body is taking out all the toxins from whatever you ate that had pesticides in it, and this is normal. And so this is rationalizing. This is what people understand to be the intellect trying to override the heart. And this happens a lot in religion. When people will try to convince people of something, they'll say, God created the universe. And then they'll say, okay, but who created God? And then you have to try to create like a story about like the Big Bang and then just chemical reactions. And that's safe because the mind wants to do that anyway. So it's almost like, okay, and then God will, like if you go in the Quran or you find scripture that you understand is revealed and you're trying to find some kind of authenticity for it in the world, you'll say, well, I can believe in an archangel because I can believe this is an inspired idea. Just like I can be an inspired person who's thinking about something to kind of help people in the world. Maybe why not take that chance and say, okay, so there's some reference to the Big Bang. So maybe all these chemical reactions happened and then we started to evolve as humans. And with that, we've got, thousands of years to have this consciousness built and it's light. So then you think, okay, so now maybe we've developed so that now our hearts can actually sort of grasp some kind of understanding of the way the world works. And then to go back from that again and say, I don't want to believe in my consciousness because I can't measure it. And I have to. So then you see how things start to almost like they don't align. And you're just like, well, where did that consciousness come from? So, like I mentioned before, sometimes thinking about these questions like that, it makes it hard for your brain to think about. And then you start to go into pseudoscience or you go into these beliefs with playing with the supernatural. And it's actually meant to almost, I want to almost say distract you from actually living a life, right? Because if you're worrying about these questions, are they really going to change anything for you? You might think, they might give me an understanding of something, but if you just live your life without thinking about these kind of questions, you're probably going to be just fine. But if you're thinking about these questions, it's just eating up your time and it's a waste, I argue. So let's go back to that scientist, for example, who's trying to understand, I want to rationalize, or I want to tell myself that what's happening to these volunteers is normal. Now, they might think, okay, well, you're a scientist and you're studying this, so they trust a scientist. This is where we have to be informed as people who are trying new things, especially with trial drugs. If something feels uncomfortable for you, regardless of what people say and regardless of what, professional they are, or if something feels unsure or like this is not normal, you're supposed to be allowed to say, no, I don't want to continue with this experiment because it's making me look like the harm is more than the benefit. If I have to lose weight a different way, but I don't have like all this weirdness on my skin, or I'm getting really, really, really sick, that it's almost, because when you vomit a lot, it actually ends up taking the acid out of your stomach and it goes up your esophagus into your teeth, and all of that starts to burn because your stomach needs all that really, really strong acid so it can digest the food that you eat. So you can imagine if all that's constantly going up and down your stomach, that's going to cause another problem outside of, whatever this new medication is going to be causing for you. So this is called being an informed citizen, or somebody who's just very aware and alert of all the different ways that we can be in the world and how to respond to this fallacy of professionalism, or it's a kind of like a fallacy of somebody who looks like, because they have uh, an understanding of something, it means that no matter what they do, they're going to do it correctly. So we almost take away the fact that, well, you're still human, right? And as human, we know that we're fallible. And God created us that. He didn't create us as humans, as angels, rather. He created angels to help inspire us, but that doesn't mean that we'll be perfect for any amount of time. Like, we might understand how to do something really well. Like, if you watch professional athletes, they've been practicing almost like their whole life. So they know that, you know, they can, some people gamble with them. Like they say, because they've practiced so much, we almost can predict how well they'll do in a game. Because, you know, we've almost been tracking how they play, and um, you know, the teammates that they have and the other sports members on like the opposite teams, and who, so it's a type of gambling, not necessarily, it's more like risk analysis. And people sometimes they just enjoy that as a lifestyle or as like a hobby or pastime, and that's fine, because that's just, it's just like another form of entertainment that gets people like a certain kind of um, adrenaline rush. People who enjoy that kind of excitement in their life, that's a completely different scenario from somebody who's actually affecting and manipulating people's lives without their knowledge. Like people who are into sports and athletes, they're all aware of this. Like they hire each other. They're all, you know, aware that, you know, I'm just going to do this for a certain amount of years and then I'm going to retire, and then someone else will come and they'll be younger. And so they understand the whole profession of it, right? People who play with jinn and who do these experiments, this ends up impacting their entire life. So then you wonder, like, there's some places in the world where uh, there tends to be genetic uh, imperfections in people, or there tends to be uh, like maladaptive ways that their bodies develop. And you almost think back to the question, like some people say, well, if God's so perfect, why did he create all these imperfections in people? And then you think back to choice and you say, well, God told us not to play with jinn. And it's almost to say, because you're playing with fire, it's going to affect you in a harmful way. Like you're made from earth, and earth is natural. Like it just grows and it helps growth. Whereas fire, it can destroy in an instant. So if you think of your body being something that's so gentle and something that's created to be, um, you know, cared for, and then you have something as like an element that's as strong as fire, and you're playing with it, of course it's going to leave you deformed in some way. If not like actual, like if you actually burn or come close to a candle, it hurts right away. So if you imagine you're trying to put this into someone's body who's dead and they're trying to wake them up before they're supposed to wake up, they're not going to come back as a normal person who has independent autonomy. They might have to be somebody who's in some way disabled or handicapped or has some kind of developmental delay. That's a completely different story from people who have, uh, you know, some people take medications while they're pregnant and then their children end up having um, some kind of developmental growth delay. And sometimes they catch up with it. Like in science and medicine, now we're understanding how to help individuals who are born like that. So it's not always cause and effect. So you understand that when you study science, it's such a beautiful thing because it tells you, if I see that when I'm pregnant, I take Advil, right? It might show that, you know, the more you take Advil, the more you might have children who are very, very, very irritable, for example, which means they get restless really easily. We don't know what that medication might do to their brain or might do to the milk that you produce to nurse them with, right? Other people will say, we've noticed this because a lot of people have commented like to their doctors about this, and then the doctors, they tell the pharmacy, and then the people who make the medication, they'll say, we should probably put this on the box. So, you know, if you're pregnant or if you're nursing, don't take this medication, take this one, this one's safer. So this is just kind of like a natural understanding of, the more you do this, the more likely this will do this. It's not that one causes the other right away. So now you have cause and effect, and then you have correlation, which is the more you do something, the more something else will happen. Or the less you do this, like the less you eat extra sugar, the less you'll have cavities, right? That could be a correlation. It doesn't say that you won't have cavities now, because if you don't brush your teeth, you could also get cavities. So if you understand the way scientists work now, you understand that it's really important to know that sometimes if you want to try something, you understand why it takes a very long time first for it to be approved. Not anybody can just say, I'm just gonna, you know, mess with somebody's life. Like First, did you talk to them and say, I want to try this experiment with you? And then are people allowed to do this? Because human rights is a thing. Like if people say no and you do it behind their back anyway, then you're supposed to get in trouble so that people don't think this is okay. And that's what jinn studies is. It's very, very prevalent in certain countries, sometimes in the Middle East, because we know of the story of Solomon. And for some reason, that area there, it just has a lot of understanding about God. But because people mix up God and jinn, they end up mixing it all up. So people just want to throw religion entirely out and stop thinking about God, stop thinking about the universe, which is sad. But to me, it's almost like if I stop thinking about religion as a bunch of rules and just think, I want to think about just being kind in the world and not trying to take these shortcuts almost and not cast spells, because spells tend to be, I want to do something bad to somebody. And then you think, that's not kind. And then you almost want to abandon that, be like, nope, never mind. Whereas a prayer is almost like, I want to be inspired because I want to contribute something healthy in the world. So if that's already your intention, then it's not called a spell, it's called a prayer. And you can understand the difference between now a spell which doesn't involve God, a prayer which involves God and angels, and then a cult, which is typically a way of doing things, and you have to do it exactly the same way. And it tends to be you have to follow this person and you have to almost pray to them or worship them. That has nothing to do with God, which is why God warns us about building idols and worshiping anything other than God and assuming that God has partners, because it leads all those bad ideas to look like their religion. But God says, I am above all of that. Like, if you want to live a really easy life, just put all of that away and just think of God as something really, really big in your heart. And then you're good. So then, when you think of religion and cults as a phenomenon of people who are grouping each other or themselves in something, that's probably the difference between the two. So if you think like in a democratic country like Canada, and you've got the census coming in and people want to know, like, what's the population of people who are Buddhists, for example, right? So then you think, well, these are people who believe in, uh, it's not really God. It's almost like they believe in what Moses believed and a little bit more, which is that God can exist in the world without looking like he's existing as a person. So it's almost like he just inspires people in a way that makes it look like they don't have a soul. So if you think, because the soul is something that God breathed into people, it's almost like a spirit. So what's the difference between a spirit and a soul? So for them, it's almost like this, there's nothing, but they don't mean nothing like nothing exists. It's just that you can't think of God as something. So then you think, oh, that's pretty cool. I want to understand that. So then maybe a lot of people believe that. Sometimes people from Asia believe in Buddhism or Taoism. So they think more of a spirit rather than an actual soul. And who's to say what the difference is between the two? It's something that in the Quran God says only God really knows what the soul is. Um, we're never going to have that much knowledge to understand what it is, and even if we do understand it, it's very difficult to explain. So God is almost giving us a break and just saying, if it looks like it's too difficult to understand, it's probably better to just leave it alone. So back to that limit where we almost sometimes when we get frustrated, we're like, why doesn't God just like tell us, like, just keep your brain in this section and don't go outside? And he does, but then some people get frustrated and they're like, well, if God exists, why doesn't he show us himself? And you think, well, because think about like anything in the world that has majesty. Like think of these really, really big, like think of a whale, how huge whales are, right? You're not going to worship a whale and call it God, but if you think of how big it is, and then you think, well, if God created it and he created the universe, then there must be something really, really big. So the smaller I think about it, the bigger it can become, but it won't scare me. And these are the things that kind of keep us balanced and keep people from losing focus in the world. Because when you think of something that's way too big and you actually come in contact with it, you don't know if it's jinn or if it's an angel, and it actually might destabilize you, which means your mental health can actually get shocked and it doesn't know what reality is anymore. It's almost like walking around and it's like, what did I just see? And that's what people in the olden days, people used to associate it with the moon. They'd say we don't know if like the moon's impacting you in a way, like they see sometimes with the waves. Sometimes they are correlated with the moon. So if the moon's closer to the earth, maybe then there's higher waves. it's hard to understand how all this might correlate with the human being and the way their mind works, right? These are people who tried experimental trials to almost understand, like, if this happens, does this happen? Like, these correlations to try to assume some understanding of how behaviors can impact or be impacted by certain natural phenomena in the world. So studying psychology helps us understand this. But then if you try to understand it from a metaphysical perspective as well, so you're trying to grapple with psychology and then metaphysics, which is an understanding of something we can't really touch, but we definitely feel, right? Which is what people call faith. And sometimes they'll study it like religion and they'll say, okay, these people believe in God, but the way they are talking about God makes it difficult for me to understand. So then it's probably usually best to just leave it and then just explore it yourself with your heart, because then it's almost like you're not relying on what people are saying anymore, and you're trying to just feel inspired. And then after a while you'll feel that maybe God will guide you to, maybe try reading this author or reading this book or talking with this person. And knowing that, like having that trust in the universe will attract it to you. Like people call it manifesting, where if you are thinking about something, you almost attract it to you. I think it's the law of attraction. So anyway, I'm gonna leave it at that. I feel like this is very I do feel like in a way I'm preaching. I don't mean to be preaching, but it's just because I've experienced this a lot and I almost want to help people discern the difference, because as you travel through this path, you'll see that it's difficult to tell the difference between all these different ideas and ways of living. But for somebody who's on the inside and knows the difference, it's easier to explain so that people on the outside who are trying to understand, these are not all the same, are they? You can say, no, they're not. It can look the same because sometimes it looks like you can have an effect on nature, but the idea isn't that you want to have an effect on nature, because that could be closer to jinn. The idea is that you just want to live in a healthy way and let God intervene for you and just open up a healthy way for you to exist.